All right. So what we were looking at yesterday was was a tshuva from Rav Weiss about a fellow who had made a pledge to help build the shul in his neighborhood, and was then decided to pick up and leave, and so did not want to pay off the balance of his tzedakah pledge. And his argument was that my whole pledge was predicated on my enjoying the shul. And now that, and part of his reason, he claims that part of the reason why he's leaving is because the new leadership in the shul is not what he expected. In other words, he was expecting one thing and he got another thing. And we can imagine all of the storylines in that halachic presentation. Yeah, that scenario. And so he picks up and he leaves and he says, I don't want to pay off the balance of my pledge because I want to help build a new shul in my new little community. So Rav Weiss deliberated on a number of different grounds. And even though he said that number one, it's unclear whether you're allowed to change from one mitzvah to another. It's clear that the fellow can't just rescind the pledge and keep the money for himself. He would have to use it for another mitzvah. But since it's unclear whether you're allowed to change from one mitzvah to another, a person in this situation would at least need to get a hataras nadarim from a beis din, who, when they would hear his argument, would be able to determine whether he has a valid argument. And the reason why he feels that it should be presented to a beis din is because it's a very subjective thing. Like, why are you really moving? Are you really moving because, like you claim, it's not what you expected and you didn't get what you wanted? Or maybe it's got something to do with your wife wanting to be closer to the grandkids, and it has nothing to do with your original pledge. And so it's not really fair for me, he says, to give you a full psak. And then that's where we really got to. He says, he says there is a way to assess that perhaps had you known that you would that we were going to be picking up and leaving, you would not have made the pledge in the first place. But that's not for me to determine. It's very difficult to be mevarer, and therefore you should get a hataras nadarim. And then he says, "Ulam kevin shemavur bahashe'ela kam v'hichriz al trumasu yesh ladun." He says, but we have another issue that we need to deliberate, because when you presented me this shaila, you said that this fellow got up in a meeting and announced his pledge. He says, "Imlo higia lichlal neder al yedei al das rabim." He says there's a concept in halacha that when you make a neder with the consent or with the sort of the consensus of a large group, then you may not even be able to get an annulment of the neder. He says, "Ayin shulchan aruch v'ayin b'tshuvos naharei afarsamon v'huva b'sefer taras yom tov b'nidra b'nadru levinyan hamikva v'achar kach nasu misham." He says there's a tshuva about a group of people who pledged to build a mikvah at a certain place, and then they ended up leaving that place. Ubo b'taina shirak al das kein nadru. And they want to rescind their pledge because they said, we only pledged to build a mikveh because we thought we were going to be living there. But now that we're not living there anymore, we want to rescind our gift. So he says it was only that we were planning to contribute to the construction of a mikveh if we were going to be living there, and so that we ourselves, our wives, could use the mikveh. Because of the Yeshlomer de Loaz Linan Basar Umdana Shalo Nadru Rak al Das came, Kishiya Dira Sam Sham. And this particular tshuva writes that you can't just give them a carte blanche and say, well, it's clear that you were only making the pledge because you were planning to live there. He says, the B'Mordechai Kosav in Yazeb Piskei Dinim Yachid Shapasak Tzedaka V'Hainu Shapasak in Bnei Ha'ir Sheni Yachol Lishanos Elamidas B'nei Ha'ir. The Mordechai paskins that if a person makes a pledge, joining together with a communal campaign, and so that it becomes a public announcement that he's pledged such and such, because we need to see how much money we can raise to see if we can build it, right? Then a person does not have a right to rescind the pledge unless the community grants him permission to rescind it. Ba'ayin b'tshuva is because, in other words, since the community was counting on those funds to help them with this project, you can't just say, well, I'm out because, I'm not living here anymore. We were counting on you and you committed yourself to be part of this community project. And that's not, whether or not you live here and you're going to benefit, that's your business, right? But we can't build the mikveh unless you make good on your pledge. Ba'ayin b'tshuvas marim shik b'chulei v'nirli te kavanas ha-Mordechai da yedei zeh shehodia lahakol shu nadar kach b'kach havi nidro kamal das rab v'lo b'hariyat Torah. He says, according to what the Mordechai is saying, is that when you make a public pledge like that, and the public is relying upon you, then you cannot get a hataras nedarim. V'lo mahani umdana, and you can't say, well, we assume that even that had he known that he wasn't going to live here, he would not have made the pledge. He says that doesn't help in a situation like this, because when the public is reliant upon your neder, then you can't rescind it. Similarly, once the money gets into the hands of a gabai, tzedakah, the tzedakah collector, you can't get a hataras nedarim and ask for your money back. It doesn't work that way. The nasa kinyan, because a kinyan has already been made, you've relinquished the money, it's no longer yours. And the sim in v'chayotze mirushusa v'chulei kevin shaldas b'nei ha'ir nadar. And when a person makes a pledge that he's going to give X amount of dollars to a community fund, and it's a public announcement, since it's done with the sort of the reliance of the community, it's almost like you made a kinyan on that amount, and you can't rescind it even if you get a hataras nadar. Lo amrin umdanav ayin b'shut chasam sofer shekasav demashin adru nedavos lebinyan beis hakneses efshir dahavi kinodar al das rabbi mayin sham. Chasam sofer says the same thing, that if a community makes a pledge for the construction of a shul, then it could be that it's considered to be noder al das rabin, that once you make that pledge, you can't rescind it, because it's being made with the reliance of the public. And what the Chassam Sofer is saying is perfectly consistent with the Mordechai that precedes him by many centuries. The imkain hu hadin benidon didan shmami natarti v'lo mahani umdina v'lo mahani hatara. He says, and therefore it would seem to me that neither a realistic assessment of why he made the pledge would help; it would be irrelevant. And similarly, a hataras nadarim would be irrelevant or would be ineffective. He says, and furthermore, you also have to be concerned about cheshad. Now, what does he mean by cheshad? It seems that there's this issue of, let's see, Siman Reish Mem Aleph in the Shulchan Aruch. Maybe a person is suspect, perhaps, of not being serious about his nadarim. Let's just take a look at Siman Reish Mem Aleph for just a second, see what Rav Weiss is talking about. It's 241.
When somebody buys an aliyah, high holy, it's like a pledge as well.
Yeah.
But that's even worse to cancel, because you're taking the place of somebody who could for the aliyah.
Exactly. Right. Okay. So for whatever, unfortunately, there is no Siman 241 Sif Chaf. Let's see. Chelik Yoredeya. So 1 second. Maybe 1 second. Maybe he's referring to a different Siman in Yoredeya. Reish Chav Ches. Maybe he's referring to Reish Chav Ches. Give me 1 second. Yeah, seems to be here. Okay, the halacha is, that's a very long siv. Nadar al das chavero. Ein matirin lo elim kein hodia lo oso shenadar al daita. What does it mean, nadar al das chavero? If a person takes a pledge with the reliance on his friend, meaning that he says, I'm doing this based on my friend's, in other words, if my friend wants me to do this, I will do this. What happened to us? We lost our screen. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Ein matirin lo elim kein hodia lo oso shenadar al daita. You cannot get a hataras nadarim from that unless your friend consents. Okay. Okay, let me just continue. Okay. So the chashad issue over here is that if a person made a neder with the reliance of somebody else, where someone else heard his neder and is relying on him to fulfill the neder, even if a person can get a hataras nadarim, you have to sarch sheyodialo shehiterlo kedei shelo yachshod oso she'avar al nidra. Yeah, so you have to notify the person that you've received a hataras nadarim. You can't just, because otherwise he's going to suspect you. So that's what the issue that is being discussed over here. So just getting back to this point that Rav Weiss is saying, the gam mishum chshada hamavur sham. He says there's also a concern that the reason why you shouldn't rescind your neder when you've made it publicly is because of chashad. Because what are people, you're going to start rumors, right? This guy made a pledge for $50,000 to help build the mikveh. Next thing we know, a month later, he made aliyah, and now we don't have his pledge. Like, what happened? So if indeed you could justify getting a hataras nadarim because he only made it because he was hoping to use the mikveh, so then that's one thing. But what about the chashad? What about the rumors that are going to circulate about this guy that he made a neder and didn't fulfill his pledge? So he says, "Aval imi shum chashad levad." But if that were the only concern, efshir sheyodia lahem mehatarasa, there would be a way of publicizing that you've received an annulment of your vow. Imlo dahavi mishum tova sha'asulo, unless if you made the pledge because of a previous favor that you had received from the community, in which case it wouldn't make a difference, whether you notified them that you got a hataras nadarim, there would still be great resentment. V'tzarech iyun b'chol zeh, and he concludes by saying we really need to investigate this more carefully. There's a lot of murkiness still lingering here. And as is quite apparent, it's not easy to clarify all of the details without, at a distance. Unless I have more information. And so he's giving us the guidelines, and then he concludes with a salutation. But you see very clearly over here that Dayan Weiss is very concerned about not fulfilling a pledge that's made publicly, even if a person can make the argument that he only made the pledge under X pretenses, and even if that's a very reasonable argument to make, he still says you need a hataras nadarim. In other words, you're leaving the community and you only made the pledge because you were hoping to get use out of the building or the mikveh or the shul that you were helping to build. And then he concludes in this last paragraph by saying that if it's a public pledge, then he's not convinced that even getting a hataras nadarim will work. In other words, let's say we have an online campaign and we publish all the names of our of our donors, or it's published in a bulletin or something like that, then even if a person were to leave the community in the middle, Rav Weiss feels that there's a problem here, because once, right, yeah, that he feels that you can't, even though it's a legitimate argument. In other words, he's willing to agree that there's a legitimate argument here, that the person is leaving. Why should he pay for a shul or a mikveh that he's never going to be using, right? But at the same time, there's a reliance from the community on that pledge, and that in itself is a reason why you can't rescind it. So the only way that, if you're not sure whether you're going to be able to fulfill a pledge that you make to a community project, you should make the pledge anonymously. So if you make the pledge anonymously and you're not getting the fanfare and no one knows about it except for a small select group of people, then it would be easier to get that annulled. But even then, you would need to get a hataras nadarim for that as well.
It's not a very nice looking Arona Kodesh, portable that was used in one of the and what happened is the person portable Arona.
This ugly aron, yeah.
So anyways, and the shul was going about, but how long then does the shul have to go by?
Continue using it.
Yeah. And are they obliged the same way, like a reverse way, to the person who gave the pledge?
I think it all depends on the stipulation and what people would consider reasonable. If a guy it depends on the amount of money, and I think it depends on the stipulation. But like, what if he said, "I expect you to use this without any time stipulation"? What's reasonable? 5 years, 10 years? Someone, in a situation like that where it was like a hideous Aron Kodesh, I can't imagine how hideous it would have to be for them to stop using it. But if that were the case, maybe they could go back to the donor and say, I mean, look, here's what I would do in a situation like that. I would try to avoid conflict, right? And bad feelings. So I would say to him, look, we've been using your Aron Kodesh for the last 5 years. It's looking a little dumpy. I'm wondering if you would consider helping us build a new one. And it would have your name on it. And okay, so maybe we could refurbish it and put on a new veneer to it so that it would make it look not as ugly. I think there are ways to maneuver around that kind of situation. It just takes a little bit of finessing, those kinds of situations. Yeah. In this case, Stein Weiss is advocating that you would need to really a tribunal of rabbis who would be able to hear your argument, and right, they'd have to be knowledgeable enough to be able to say, look, that you have a reasonable argument, and be able to really investigate the situation. I think that in some situation, and the reason why he's saying that is because we don't want this to become like a game, Yeah, that wouldn't cut it. That would not cut getting an annulment of a vow for tzedakah, because you can't get a blanket hataras nadarim when you pledge to do a mitzvah. Yeah. Okay. So let's get back to our text. We're on page 16. Let's see, where are we up to? Okay, so we saw this already. Yes, so this was what we had seen before. A person had made a pledge to donate money to a specific mitzvah, like to purchase the Haftorah cloth. And now they want him to help build the mikveh. So there you should do a Hataras Nadarim, and you can do a Hataras Nadarim to go from one mitzvah to another. And that's where we started this whole discussion, okay? Okay. Right, so as a general rule, the Gaboim are not allowed to change unless there's an emergency, like a Pidyon Shvuyim or something like that. Like they needed to ransom back a person whose life is in danger. So then I think that there is permission granted. I don't remember all the details, but the Gemara itself talks about this idea that if the Gaboim collected money for a certain project, they're not allowed to change it to something else unless they're the most dire of circumstances. Yeah. Hataras Nadarim, yeah. Okay, so what Doug was talking about is buying an aliyah. So that's in our next halacha. Akona mitzvah nimkeres al yedei beis hakneses. If you purchase a mitzvah that is being sold by the shul, kagon aliyah l'torah v'chayotze bo. Let's say you're purchasing an aliyah. Afilu omar b'li neder. Even if you said, your friend Billy Neder, okay? Nonetheless, chayiv lases es demei hamitzvah la'oso beis hakneses. You nevertheless are obligated to give that money to the shul, whatever you pledged. Ve'eno rashai l'sitam lebeis hakneses acher. And you can't say, well, I'll give it to my shul. Now, you're a guest at someone's shul and you make a pledge for tzedakah. You can't say, oh, I'll give the money to another shul. It doesn't work that way. Yeah. I think it's great what some of the shuls do, and I keep trying to promote it. And when I was in shul, I think I mentioned this to you. I was in the shul in where is it? In for Shabbos. Why can't I get the word out of my brain? Ranana. I was in Ranana for Shabbos. And so I would daven at a place called the Shtibel. And after my aliyah, they gave me like a postcard with a QR code. So after Shabbos, just put your phone on it and brings up the website where you can make your pledge. Can't be easier, right? There you go. Yeah, I told the office we should do that here. So I'm hoping that they'll print up the things. Yeah. Okay. Nodar litzdaka be'asmachta. Kagon. Let's say you made a pledge for tzedakah. Yeah, we learned this also. If you made an asmachta pledge, which basically means that if this, then this. Like if I end up getting the deal that I've been working on, I will give a certain amount of my profits from the deal to tzedakah. And then if the deal does succeed, you're chayav lases. You have to make good on that pledge. Let's say if my company goes public, right, which is a huge windfall, I'll give a certain amount to tzedakah. You got to do that. Okay. Next halacha. So we saw this as well already. Shnaim shenisarvu bedavar v'hisna kol echad shim ha'emes lo kidbar v'yitain l'tzedakah sikum misuyam. Two guys have a conflict about something, right? We saw, the example I gave was who won the 1969 World Series, and each one is convinced that they're right, and he says, if I'm wrong, I'll give $100 to charity. So like a friendly bet, right? Friendly bet. So imzeh sheta hayabar lo loloshim safik shekacha yahadavar pater milases litzdaka shazeh doimel lenidrei shgagos. If the guy who ended up being mistaken was absolutely certain at the time when he made the bet, and he just blew it, right? So then you could argue that he is pater from giving that pledge because he made a neder he made a pledge under false pretenses. But if he wasn't sure and he just wanted to go along with the friendly bet, he said, no, I think it was the White Sox. I'm pretty sure it was the White Sox, So in that situation, if he's wrong, he has to give the money because he knew at the time that he made the neder that it could be that he's mistaken. Okay. So that's obviously a difficult thing to assess, what were you thinking at the time? Were you absolutely sure that you were right and you just blew it? Or did you know that there was a possibility that you would be mistaken? It depends. Like I've been in situations where I've made a friendly bet, knowing that I could be wrong, but just it's fun, you go along with the guys. Yeah. Okay. So the next siman is a new chapter. I believe that Monday is a stat holiday. Do I have that right? So we'll pick it up in Mirz Hashem Tuesday morning. Oh, is that July 4th? Okay, but we are proud Canadians, and so we will. I still wave the American flag, but we'll continue on Tuesday. Have a good Shabbos, everyone.